So welcome everyone to tonight's session in our series, Field Guide for Aspiring Chaplains, where tonight we're going to be discussing hospice and palliative care. We've arranged this season to be kind of sector specific. So tonight we're going to discuss hospice and palliative care. My name is Michael Skaggs. I'm Director of Programs for the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, and we're very happy to have you with us today. And we're also grateful to the sponsors of the Field Guide series that literally make this possible. I want to thank Bayan Islamic Graduate School, Candler School of Theology at Emory University, Claremont School of Theology, Iliff School of Theology, Union Theological Seminary, and then just within the past couple of days, Boston College School of Theology and Ministry has joined us as a sponsor as well. So we're very happy to have you. I'm just trying to mute everybody here. If you can mute yourself.
Yes, very soon. We're almost there.
I'm just going to hit mute a couple of times. I'm sorry. I feel so bad. All right, we really appreciate the support of all of our sponsors, and we couldn't do this without them. So let me just say a couple of words to set us up, and then I'll hand it over. Some of you have noticed that we are recording. So we record this. You can watch it later. That way, if you miss a point or if you have to leave, you can always come back and watch the entire thing. But I really want to make note of that because we have the Q&A at the end of tonight's session. And so if you want to ask a question live, you can always type a question in the Q&A, but if you want to ask a question live, bear in mind that we are recording so that you will be visible and audible if you choose to do that. When we send out the link to the recording, there's just a little bitty brief survey. I know that everyone has survey fatigue. I'm going to pile on though. Please just take like 2 minutes to fill it out. It helps us plan future events. So thank you. With that, let me introduce tonight's speakers. Sarah Byrne-Martelli is bereavement coordinator and a chaplain at Massachusetts General Hospital. Jason Callahan is chaplain at Virginia Commonwealth University Massey Cancer Center. Paul Gouchett is a research chaplain at M Health Fairview in Minnesota. He's also a Transforming Chaplaincy Fellow. And Edward Pignate is a palliative care chaplain and educator at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. We're very grateful to all of you for being with us tonight. Sarah, I turn it to you.
Thank you. Do we have a particular set of questions that you'd like us to address?
Really, I think that what is most helpful is if we could just hear kind of how you ended up doing the work that you're doing and what that looks like on a daily basis. We get lots of questions from folks who, you know, they're interested in chaplaincy in general, but they don't really know what they want to do. And I think that a lot of that is informed by the fact that they've never seen this work being done. So just kind of give us a peek into what this job entails and how you got here.
Sure, thank you. So I was board certified in 2003 or 4, and my first job just happened to be in hospice. So I started doing, it was actually a well-established visiting nurse association with a new hospice program. So I was actually kind of able to start it from the ground up and learn as I went. So I was the only chaplain. I also then became the bereavement coordinator, and then we grew and grew. And so I had to write the spiritual care documentation. I wrote all the bereavement materials and was just really trying to network. There was a really great, the Hospice Federation of Massachusetts has a bunch of like chaplain networking, at least they did at the time. And so I was able to learn from my peers. So I've been a chaplain for, almost 20 years. So half the time has been in home hospice, which has given me a great sense of, caring for patients at end of life, of working with my nurses and social work colleagues. After that, I worked at NYU Medical Center as the staff chaplain there through healthcare chaplaincy. And towards the end of my time there, there was palliative care was not super integrated and very small at the time. This was 2007. They had a palliative care NP, a physician, and a social worker who was kind of the oncology social worker. So I kind of ended up inserting myself slowly into the team and just kind of crashed the team and would round with them once a week. So that way I really learned a lot more about like palliative care consults and kind of the kinds of conversations we were looking at, like goals of care and decision-making and that kind of aspect of palliative care. In my current role, I'm the palliative care chaplain under the palliative care division at MGH, and this was a newly established role. So I work with, there's 4 staff social workers, many physicians and NPs. We have palliative care fellows who are MDs and NPs. And so our census, can get up to about 70. So obviously I don't see everyone, but what I do is I really work based on referrals, and we round every morning as a team. We talk through our patient list, new referrals, new consults. We're a consult service. So we're not really the primary team, but when we do that, fortunately, this is my third year there, and I've really been able to kind of educate the team bit by bit and teach the fellows about spiritual distress, existential distress, and kind of really had to kind of focus where refers were coming from. So it's not just like, let's go see all the people or go see all these patients, or this patient's very religious or this patient's not religious, but instead to really focus on, are they using language of hope and miracles? Are they struggling with a new diagnosis, struggling with end of life concerns, religious conflict within the family, those kinds of things. And I think over time, I've really gotten to clarify that the role of the palliative care chaplain is really in those in-between places where people are kind of discerning treatment, discerning what's next for them, and how their faith and, spiritual, not religious, whatever, everyone has a way of making decisions, right? Everyone has a worldview and a sense of how they make meaning. And so I really see my role as integrating those concepts to support the patient and family really as part of the team. So I do a lot of joint visits, attend family meetings. And to be honest, it's been hard to integrate into the team because it was just a new concept. They were not used to having an embedded chaplain. And I'm sure my colleagues who are in palliative care, can speak to that too. And so it was a lot of sort of steady showing up, advocating, demonstrating, what the role of chaplaincy really is. And also working with my colleagues in the spiritual care department, because, there's not that many of us, so we have to coordinate very well too. So I guess hopefully that's a good start. Maybe I'll pass it to my colleagues.
Well, let me ask you just briefly, you mentioned in sort of when we met before 8 o'clock that you had just written a denominationally focused book. Tell us a little bit about what was your educational path before you ended up in that very first job that you had to sort of build up from there, but how did you end up doing it, or what was your training up to that point?
Mm-hmm. I think I was always, back in the day, I've always been interested in faith and grief and kind of just the life of faith, just growing up in my family, which was Catholic and Presbyterian and Jewish and evangelical, and I'm Orthodox Christian. So it was like an interesting mix of faith background, sort of practiced all quite authentically. I was a religion major in college. I went to Haverford College, and then actually was thinking I wanted to be a religion professor, and I went to Harvard Divinity School with the intention of doing the MTS there. But then when I was there, I took my first unit of CPE. And once I got into CPE, I was like, boom, this is where I'm called to be. And also I realized I'm maybe not like a super academic, like religion person. And so I switched to the MDiv, took more like chaplaincy, counseling courses, grief and loss, like trauma, all those kinds of courses. And then I went right into a CPE residency in Boston. And then I went right into my first chaplain position. So I was kind of like, I kind of did like a very like straight, trajectory into it. But I will say my grief and loss training has just been gained over time through doing the job, doing trainings, attending webinars, that kind of stuff. So I would not say I was an expert in that area at all. But I tried to just like go to conferences and really learn by doing more about grief. And that's what I wrote my book about. Recently, I did a doctor of ministry. So I wrote a book about grief and bereavement.
Thank you. All right, Jason, I'm going to pass the task to you. A brief history of Jason Callahan from education to today.
Can you hear me? Perfect now. Good to see everyone. So I did not follow a direct path to chaplaincy. It was interesting because I actually was working in advertising in New York City, but I had a palliative care experience when my grandmother was dying. So it was just one of these experiences where I interacted with the chaplain, and I just kind of became aware that there was something else out there. I always had a pastoral identity, but as a humanist, I wasn't religious, so it didn't really make sense for me to go to seminary in order to become a pastor or anything like that. Even though I grew up Presbyterian by my family, I myself had never really accepted, that faith for something that was going to be my way of life. But I did see the value in a lot of pastoral ministries, and so it really intrigued me. And when I decided to get out of advertising, the pastor at the church that I did attend growing up mentioned that I had a call, or at least what she thought was a calling, even though she knew I was humanist. But fortunately, the seminary I went to had a trial year where you kind of go to seminary, see if it's something you want. It was a scholarship program. And I ended up staying because I started realizing that there might be a path for chaplaincy for me. So I went to seminary, I completed that, and immediately after that came to VCU, where I'm currently employed, and did my CPE program. I did my internship there. I immediately went into a residency. And then after that, I became what's called a PRN chaplain, which is you're not on the staff full time, but they call you if they need you to fill in. And what the PRN position did is it really allowed me to experience a lot of the different specialties that chaplains will work in. And one of the major ones that I was working in was palliative care, which I told you I already had a palliative experience in the past. But because I was doing a lot of overnight work, I would be on palliative care a lot. There's something called the wolf hour, right? Where it's like babies are born and also a lot of people die. And I just happened to be a chaplain who was always in the house when people were dying. So I got exposed a lot. I developed a strong relationship with the chaplain who was the palliative care chaplain at the time. And it was just a kind of a natural transition as he did his fellowship actually with the transforming chaplaincy as well. He did a fellowship and I slid into the position that he had, became full-time palliative care chaplain. Of course, I mean, I still work there today because I have a big passion for it. It was interesting for me because a little bit different, I think, than what Sarah has. We have a consult service. A lot of palliative care teams actually are a consult-based service, which means that they're going to see patients all over the hospital. And we have that, but we're fortunate that in addition to that, we have an inpatient palliative care unit where there's 11 beds. So it's a little different. A lot of times when people come from the consult service, they could get put directly in the palliative care unit, which really gives us the opportunity to do some more advanced interventions. Palliative care, because it can be added on to a lot of different services, it gives you an opportunity to provide chaplaincy at an earlier point. So I think it's really cool because you can enhance the spiritual dynamic of people's lives. And that goes whether they're religious or not. They can be humanists like myself, various belief systems, philosophies, but they can benefit from palliative care. In addition to that, I think that palliative care is one of those special things because, and specifically chaplaincy, because you know that that's going to be one of the dimensions of their life that they're going to uphold, and really, they're really going to seek chaplain support. If you're dealing with traumas and different things like that, sometimes palliative care could come into play. You might see the chaplain, but a lot of times people aren't really expecting chaplains to be there. But if you're expecting someone to die, then you have a prolonged time, hopefully, from the time they get diagnosed until they do pass away. VCU is also really cool because our Massey Cancer Center does have an outpatient clinic as well. So when people actually get diagnosed, we can really start seeing them a lot earlier on. So whether they're dealing with cancer for 10 years or just 1 year, it allows us to get integrated earlier on so people are not afraid of the chaplain. I think it's really cool because it really allows us to do some advanced interventions as well. So we have a pretty good program where you can see people outpatient. They come into the critical care hospitals, and then they, once they get to the point where they want to focus on comfort measures, they can then go straight to the palliative care unit. One of the other cool bridges is palliative is used a lot of times as a step to hospice. So a lot of people want to actually die at home around the people that they love. And here at VCU, we have the palliative care unit that also has what's called general inpatient hospice. And that's where we have a hospice agency that we partner with, where they can have additional hospice services actually served on the unit. And a lot of times that serves as a bridge for that same hospice agency to provide hospice services when they get home. And that's a real benefit because hospice gives you like 13 months of bereavement support, which is one of the other benefits, like Sarah was saying, because the bereavement issues really is a community issue. The people that are left behind when a loved one dies, they need support afterwards. And that actually affects how they experience future healthcare and then future people in their family dying again, just those experiences. So if you have really good bereavement support, it can then actually help them have good deaths whenever a death is coming again in the future. So that's one of the reasons why I love it, because it's completely integrated from every step of, you know, admission and initial diagnosis all the way through bereavement. I don't know, do you have any other questions maybe you'll want me to answer?
I'm sure those will sort of surface as we continue. So thank you, Jason. And I really appreciate, we went in a lot of ways from one end of the spectrum to the other, where Sarah had this very traditional, straight through denominational, boom, you're a chaplain. Jason, humanist, not, you couldn't even really call it a path. It just sort of happened. But the point is, there is no one way into chaplaincy. There are as many paths into it as there are people, as kind of, you know, heady as that sounds. I think it's really true. Thank you, Jason. Paul, same question to you. Tell us your story.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. I hope the suspense wasn't killing everybody. Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Galshud. I am sort of the imposter here in some ways, because I got to be a inpatient palliative care chaplain for about 10 years. I'm not technically doing that. That's kind of like, I guess, my foreshadowing. I think it started with education and kind of build into that. So in seminary, I don't know if they still call it this way today, but I was a pipeliner. Came right out of college, went right into seminary. And my background is I'm a Lutheran pastor. And if you care about all the little rabbit trails of Christianity, I'm an evangelical Lutheran Church in America pastor, and have been since I was 26 years old, which was just a couple of years ago. Yeah, okay. Okay. So yeah, what happened was, during my years of seminary, I got introduced to hospice palliative care because I was a hospice chaplain during my vicarage or my internship. And kind of fell in love with it and was able to do a couple of visits with people, and it was moving to me in that experience. Like Sarah, in the Lutheran tradition, you have to do a unit of clinical pastoral education before you can enter into becoming a pastor. So kind of got the bug, got hooked. And in the Lutheran tradition, you have to, if you're going the pastor ordination route, you have to do at least 3 years in the congregation. I like the congregation, so I did it for a while. Came out, and after 7 years, I went into a chaplain residency so I could knock out the rest of the units that I needed to become a chaplain. So I did that in the Chicago area. I'm originally from Minnesota. My first chaplain job was in Milwaukee in a Catholic healthcare system. Did that for 3 years. I was also a bereavement coordinator. I think Sarah does some of that. And then also I was a critical incident stress management coordinator. And that's not something we're going to talk about, but that's important in terms of staff support, especially with all the sentinel events that have been happening these days. My joke is that I keep following Highway 94. If you're familiar with the Midwest, I went Chicago to Milwaukee, and I had to leave all the good custard in Milwaukee and came back to Minnesota. And so here I've been for about, I don't know, maybe 15 years now. And that's where I became a palliative care chaplain. It was half my job, and I was half staff chaplain job. And that's another thing I think that's pretty interesting, is that there are so many different models for how Edward at Northwestern's a chaplain, Sarah out in Massachusetts, Jason at VCU, and all of our colleagues, that it's just really interesting. And then 10 years into it, this thing called transforming chaplaincy happened, and I got a chance to go back to school, got a master's in public health where it taught me research skills. So my line is, even though I've technically left the bedside of palliative care, it's never left me. So now Transforming Chaplaincy was a grant-funded organization. It's now continuing on. And there's something called the Hospice, Palliative, Spiritual Care Research Network. We'd love to have you join. There's about 800 of us now that are a part of it. And Edward, Jason, and Sarah are part of it. In fact, Sarah just became our new moderator of a special interest group for inpatient palliative care. So delighted to say that out loud here. I better stop talking there. I could keep going, but that's some background.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I really would encourage everyone to check out Transforming Chaplaincy, check out the research that they sort of highlight, that the networks are promoting. Even if you're not a chaplain, even if you're just getting interested in this, to see what types of things the field is studying and how it approaches these questions from a scientific perspective, I think is really helpful. It gives you an entirely new perspective on how chaplains think about this work and how they can improve their work. Thank you, Paul. All right, Edward, we've saved the best for last. Tell us your story, please.
Hi, can everyone hear me? That's a lot of pressure, Michael. So my name is Edward Peñate. I'm a palliative care chaplain at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and that is the sister organization with Northwestern University. And we're located in downtown Chicago. And my hospital setting is a 900-bed trauma level 1 hospital. And as Paul mentioned, and I think as we were listening to Sarah and Jason's explanation of their settings, that the model of palliative care at our institution is primarily an inpatient, is both inpatient and outpatient. My setting as a palliative care chaplain, although it takes me in both settings of inpatient, outpatient, most of my time is dedicated to the inpatient setting, right? But stepping back about how I got to palliative care, I think one, I want to mention that I came from 15 years of congregational ministry before I came into the healthcare context. And so about 10 years ago, what was introduced to me was an experience to do work in the prison setting, in the state prison in the state of Illinois. And so there with a colleague who was a staff chaplain there with a bit of CPE training under his belt, really worked with me very closely. And that was the first experience I had with chaplaincy work, right, in the prison setting. And I think from his influence, that experience was just aligning well with what I came to identify about myself, about my gifts and my leanings and my preferences of what type of work I wanted to devote myself to. And so out of that, there was this curiosity that I wanted to explore and affirm and confirm. And if this was the shift that I was wanting to make at that point in time. And so at that time, I did the prison chaplaincy work as a volunteer for about 3 years. And then I pursued CPE experience, a clinical pastoral education experience at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, because that's where I live and I continue living here. And so it began with an internship for me. So I do want to highlight that as I would talk about my training background to become a palliative care practitioner, is that it had a foundation of CPE training. And it began with CPE internship, which moved forward into a residency. What I would like to highlight about the residency for me was that the residency offers a full-time sample of experience as a clinical practitioner. And so it's as if you're working and you're considered a full-time employee for that institution wherever you do the residency. And that residency for me which is a combination of 1 internship and 3 units of CPE. So a total of 4 units of CPE was the core foundation that I can identify that was the grounding, the foundation that I had to start with, and that I consider it necessary to the evolution of my training and even my practice today. And so for me, residency was also a key opportunity for me to experience different sample settings within the clinical context. And so you get for me, in my setting, I was offered a transplant service type of experience for a period of time, an oncology service. And because I'm bilingual English, Spanish speaking, it opened up other opportunities. And so for me, during my residency, gave me a lot of opportunities to work with palliative care team at Northwestern from beginning residency. Not all the time, but I did follow the same patients that were from the Latinx community. And so that piqued my curiosity about what is this? Because at that time I was unfamiliar with what that is. And so for me, that began to pique a curiosity of what this is and explore more. And then when I wanted to understand more, the palliative care team was just so available and so generous with me. And I'm not talking about other chaplains, I'm talking about physicians, APNs, social workers, etc. And they were just so generous to share more about what this is as a specialty service. And so after my residency, there was an opportunity offered. And so I was invited to form part of the palliative care team at Northwestern. And so I went into this straight into residency. Here is what I want to distinguish a little bit of my ongoing training, because after I completed my CPE training, which was essential, one of the tracks that I was pursuing was board certification with Association of Professional Chaplains. And so that's one consideration that I want to highlight, that as I was doing this work already, my pursuit was also to become a board certified chaplain. The other piece was that I was on the job trained to become a palliative care specialist, right? And I say that a palliative care specialist, because one of the things in the job training was to also own that identification, that identity as a palliative care provider. In other words, I do have a specialty, and that's spiritual care, but we all claim an identity as palliative care members as a palliative care provider. And so that had implications for my training as well. I was no longer going to be exclusively a spiritual care specialist, but now I have this identity, and I was owning this new role as a palliative care provider. And so on the job training, which was in the context of a very invested and generous team, I learned with them, right? And sure, there was as on the job training, you have moments of feeling stretched, right? I'm not too familiar with this work. I have not done this before. And there's those growing moments. But for me, what I became after a while, assessing my own developmental needs, I started identifying where am I at with becoming a specialized advanced level training as a palliative care practitioner, and how does that look like for me moving forward here? And so that also involved, aside from the on-job training, that was a major element of my advanced training, but that also brought in other curiosities and plans to further train. And so, for example, one of the specialty areas of palliative medicine is how to facilitate complex communication and medical decision-making. And so a lot of the palliative care practitioners have advanced training in communication skill training, and that's sought out in various ways. One of those ways is PalliTalk, Vital Talk. And so that was part of my training as to become a palliative care practitioner. The other, once you see in a clinical setting, one of the things that I found necessary was, again, to pursue advanced training, even as a spiritual care specialist, but also as a palliative care specialist, and that means I have to do assessments outside the scope of just spiritual care domains, but I had to do assessments of symptom management and ethical aspects, etc. And so I had to pursue advanced training. And there's various trainings offered by different institutions like George Washington, CSU, and other places where they can train you to become skilled in those areas, to become, for example, competent in doing pain and symptom assessments as a generalist, not as a physician, because that's not what I'm claiming in my role, but as a generalist in the sense that I can ask those good questions so that I can coordinate with my team about the needs in the clinical setting, right? So as I was getting this experience, I also saw so many collaborations going on in the palliative care team. And one that we all do is we educate, right? We educate, we learn as an interdisciplinary team, but we also are educators for the broader community, not just NMH, but broader community. And so that is a passion of mine, also an identity as an educator. And so I pursued advanced training in education, adult learning theory, and for specifically in the clinical context, right? So this led me to another major piece of my contributions and trainings and research. And because part of my leanings is to do a lot of research about spiritual care training for non-chaplain clinicians, right? And so a lot of my work has been done with palliative care physician fellows, right, about building competencies for them to become spiritual care generalists, right? And so these are, as I said this, that I was assessing where I needed to develop more. This is actually an ongoing work that I do, you know, not every single month, but at certain moments, at certain key moments, what do I need to do here moving forward about getting better at these certain domains, certain realms of the expertise as a palliative care practitioner, right? So that's my story.
Thank you very much, Edward. And I want to clarify very quickly, there was a question, and I suggested holding the question for breakout groups. I don't think I said that at the beginning, but we have breakout groups at 9 o'clock. If you would like, we turn the recording off, and then you can have a little bit of a more intimate conversation. So that's a good time for like really specific questions. So thanks to all four of you. I think that we see a real diversity in paths into this work and the type of work that you do on a daily basis, but there are some general themes that are common from place to place. One thing that I want to ask right at the outset before we get to some other questions, we titled this session Hospice and Palliative Care. Not the same thing. We're talking about them in the same conversation, but they're not the same thing. I think I want to ask Sarah in particular, because you have mentioned specific roles. I was in hospice, then I'm in palliative care. So what is the quickest way to distinguish these two, and what sets them apart from one another?
Thanks. The quickest way would be that palliative care is a big umbrella and hospice is a subset within palliative care. So palliative care is multidisciplinary interprofessional care for patients and families facing serious illness. That's sort of the quickest. It's an extra layer of support, as we like to say. So it can be patients who are oncology patients, heart failure, transplant, I mean, any number of types of diagnoses. It sort of grew out of, I think, mostly oncology care, but now has really broadened into really every type of diagnosis. Hospice specifically is care for patients with any type of diagnosis. They qualify with very specific medical qualifications. It's a Medicare benefit, and other insurances cover hospice care if you meet particular criteria. And hospice diagnosis indicates that if your disease progressed as expected, you would have a 6 months or less 6 months or less to live. Now, that said, sometimes, you don't get kicked off after 6 months, of course. You can requalify if your illness is progressing and needs the layer of support that hospice provides. So one thing that's really interesting about hospice is, just in terms of being a chaplain, is that it's actually a Medicare regulation for chaplains to do an assessment of patients and families within 5 days of admission. Now, of course, they can always say no thanks, or they don't have to see the chaplain, but it's built into the system to have a social work assessment, to perhaps have a volunteer, obviously to have a nursing in nursing support, and to have a spiritual assessment. So it's actually, it's a really interesting place to be a chaplain, because you really are part of it. Palliative care more broadly in a hospital setting or an outpatient setting may eventually, as Jason indicated, you may at some point, your palliative care patients may be appropriate for hospice, both medically appropriate and also appropriate in terms of their goals of care. They're not seeking, for example, cancer-directed treatment or curative treatment anymore, but we don't stop treatment. And that's a really important thing to talk about. There's all this language around like fighting and giving up and, giving in and all this kind of stuff you hear a lot about when patients are faced with third, fourth rounds of chemotherapy, for example. But instead, it's more just kind of a shift towards focusing on comfort-focused care. And palliative care, you can be pursuing palliative care to support your symptoms, nausea, pain, obviously, psychosocial stuff, spiritual issues. All those things can be concurrent with potentially curative or sort of life-lengthening treatment. You can have those at the same time. But hospice really is more of a turn towards focusing on end-of-life care. And that may be for 3 weeks, or it might be for 2 years. But it's really companioning patients and families as the center of that care.
I also want to mention back in January, we did a webinar called Palliative Care and the Patient Perspective. And so folks, if you're interested in this, you might want to go and watch that as well. We have a good discussion there on how hospice sometimes gets lumped in with palliative care in the sort of the cultural mind. But as Sarah has indicated, that is clearly not the case. Okay, so I want to open the floor to some other questions. We have a couple already, so I'll start asking those, and then we'll get as many of them as we can. Sarah, since you answered that question, I'll direct this elsewhere. Maybe I'll direct this to Paul. We use a lot of terms in this world that sort of come natural to chaplains or those of us who work with chaplains, but they're actually very highly defined. So the first question we got is, what is the difference between a chaplain residency and being a chaplain in CPE? Good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. I don't think any of us are ACPE, or Association of Clinical Pastoral Education educators. So I think you picked on me because I'm the oldest, I think. No, just joking. So I've been around for a while, but there are, in larger CPE programs, they have sort of a mix and match way of approaching this. For a lot of us in our seminary traditions, or Jason's story is really cool and how he kind of stumbled into this by life. But a lot of us get into it from our first unit, or what they often call level 1. You can be somewhere like living in, Lexington, Kentucky, and if you got access to a CPE program and you're still like a pastor in a congregation, you can do CPE for like, some programs have like 6 to 8 month programs where you have kind of, some call it extended units. But the key thing is you're doing it as a level 2 student. So you might do it over 4 years, but some of us, I think most of us also, we did a residency where you have a chance to do it in a condensed form. We don't really have any data that tell us that that's a better format versus, doing it in a compact way for like a year versus extending it out over like a course of like 4 years. So I hope that helps answer the question. The key thing is, your first unit's always like level 1, and then you hope their subsequent units after that are what they call level 2, kind of show you are a more advanced person learning the competencies.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned ACPE. Again, when you are in this world all the time, you don't even think about this, but folks, do check them out, acpe.edu. This will tell you everything you need to know about CPE. Plenty of resources out there for that. And we can always help you if you need more information. Jason, I want to direct this question to you that has to do with traits that are critical to this work, maybe helpful, and these can be innate, but you can also foster them as well. So what do you need to be a chaplain that you can't learn in the classroom?
Can you hear me? All right. So for me, I think everyone is kind of working on something. I think we all have different skill sets coming into chaplaincy, where when you do your units of CPE, it's really going to help you sharpen those things. For me specifically, one of the things that I think has been most beneficial as far as a skill to have is just the ability to be resilient. As a chaplain, you never really know what you're walking into. You try to inform yourself as much as possible, either reviewing chart notes, preparing yourself with information that other people have picked up, especially working in palliative care, because a lot of times you'll be working with patients who have already seen other chaplains when they were under other specialty services. But just being able to be resilient, to be able to hold that space and allow people to be able to have their own experiences, while also being able to just continue being present with people is important. One of the other things that you have to do, and I think that Edward really alluded to this, is develop your communication skills as well. I think Ariadne Labs is another place that has some communication development skills, and most palliative care programs will already say, hey, you have to focus on some of these things, and communication is one of the big things, because sometimes we have to have conversations, what we call goals of care conversations, where it's not just the medical, but it's being able to listen and convey information in a way that allows people to process appropriately so that they can then make decisions. One of the places that I think people can really go to develop some of their pre-palliative skills is if you go to the CAPC, I think it's capc.org is the website, and they will have some modules that you can actually do that will highlight a lot of the necessary skills that palliative care chaplains will need. And if you have, say for instance, if you're in the CPE program that your host hospital is a member of CAPC, you can access this and it should be paid for you if you actually use your email address. So I'd say, go check that out. That's the Center to Advance Palliative Care. But I guess we could put thank you so much, Sarah, for putting that link in there. And that'll really point you to some of the other things that'll help educate you to head into this field.
Thank you very much, Jason. I have a question that I would like to hear everybody's perspective, but it might take a moment to think about. So I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm going to turn to Edward on a very specific one to give everyone else some time to think. I would like to know, and this is a question that was in chat, the most rewarding part of your job and the most challenging part of your job that you want to discuss publicly. So to give you time to think of that, Edward, I'm going to ask you this very specific question. This person says that they're about to begin a residency at a certain hospital, and it provides a palliative care specialty. Does this type of training translate to different institutions? That's a really good question. So you go through this training at one place and you have this, ribbon that you wear. Can you then take that somewhere else, typically in the industry, so to speak?
It's a really good question. It's very subjective, just like every institution and CPE program. I don't know about that offering that they do with CPE. CPE they do have a shared document references about their goals with the CPE, but it really is shaped by the institution. So I don't know much about that program. And so one of the things that is very important, and I've had this conversation at different points, is how important it is to learn in the context of palliative care with palliative care specialists, including palliative care chaplains, palliative care social workers, palliative care team. And when that is not done in those ways or facilitated, where you're practicing this work with other specialists in this field, I think it's different. right? I've often wondered how those skills will evolve and competencies will evolve, right? And so I do not know much about this program, but those are things to consider. So I know that's not, so that will matter, right? And it will show up in clinical practice when you go anywhere, right? So for example, and I'm very sensitive to what a learner can achieve in 1 year residency or even 2. I mean, I've been doing this in palliative care for 4 or 5 years, and I'm still learning, right? I'm still learning my craft, right? And I try to own that humility in the sense to keep me very curious and moving and progressing forward, right? And so, but again, regarding that training program, I do not know, I can't comment further. So it'll be a great question to ask the program itself about who leads it, right? And what does that experience of a specialty training look like for that context, right?
Well, and I think it's important to note that no matter what any given program might be called, whatever institution is, the being able to summarize the content, outcomes, learning goals, whatever, is kind of a way of getting around that. Does this particular program translate to another institution? Well, who knows? But if you can say, I have learned and practiced X, Y, and Z for the past however many years, that gets you around that problem of being able to identify this program. All right, so you've had some time to think. We'll just go alphabetically down the list. Most rewarding aspect of this work, most challenging. Sarah.
Well, actually, I would say the most rewarding aspect of this work is, I feel like this, I'm verklempt, being able to be with patients and families in difficult, serious illness situations where there can be lots of pain and suffering, and being able to be part of a team that really seeks to have clear communication, honest communication about what's really going on, to meet people where they are and to hold that with them in a way that, alleviates some suffering, or if it doesn't alleviate it, at least we can talk about it honestly, what's going on. I mean, there's so many sacred moments that are so beautiful in caring for patients with serious illness as they discern, their life path, their meaning making, the way that they process their faith, the way that they think about their family and their, life in this world. What does it mean for your life to be drawing to a close, to be complete, and to really be with patients who can experience peace at end of life, and to witness that, and to know that you're part of a team that's really facilitating that using these skills that everyone has spoke about so well. It's just really an honor to be doing it, truly. And it's especially good to be doing it as part of a team, like to be in a joint visit, to be in a family meeting where, sometimes people's decision-making really does come from their spiritual and existential way of looking at the world. And so to be in a family meeting where they're like, oh, they won't make a decision, they want a miracle, and the doctor and this and that. And it's like, I've gotten to know the patient and family. Even if we don't necessarily share the same viewpoint or same meaning making, I understand where they're coming from. I can connect with them using their language and their frame of thinking about the world. And so in establishing trust, in understanding their process, and understanding kind of the barriers to making that decision, if they feel like they're playing God or they feel like they're giving up, to be able to name that as the chaplain, and like really to do that confidently and compassionately within the team, which has taken me time to get there. Like, to be clear, I did not launch into this being able to do it. But to be able to have that experience in a family meeting where, something shifts, and it really is because of that trusting chaplaincy relationship that you have with the family, that is really rewarding. And I'd like to think that, it doesn't happen all the time, right? But when there's moments like that happen in a medical meeting with, the neuro-oncologist and the social worker and the nurse and the family and all your team members, they're witnessing what it really is to do actual interprofessional patient-centered care. And so it's beautiful to be a part of that. The flip side, the hardest part, I would say, is truthfully, I think, dealing with many conceptions and stereotypes of what chaplaincy is over the many years I've done this. I mean, my first job in hospice actually was really great because I did work closely with nurses and social workers, but they also expected me to like be on call all the time. Now, would they ever ask a nurse to just be on call all the time? No. But they asked the chaplain because it's a calling, but this is my first job. And I'm like, so over time I had to learn how to sort of articulate what we do as a professional thing. Yes, it's a calling. And that's the palliative care. And yes, it's a calling. And it's my professional skill set that I offer. And so to integrate into the team and to really like challenge, we don't just go in and hold hands, why would they pay me to do that anyways, right? But instead we bring a particular skill set. And so I still, constantly, we still get, oh, they're really religious. Can you go do a little prayer? Which is fine. Of course I can do a prayer for a religious person, but that's not a person in spiritual distress. They might be fine. They have their priest, they watch the Catholic Mass on TV. They're good. The people that really need spiritual support, right, are the ones who are struggling and suffering that we can sit with. It does, religious or non-religious. And so having to constantly explain that and advocate that and embody that all the time can sometimes be tiring. But so that's the hardest part, but it matters. And, showing up and showing up and showing up, I also think, over time, these things change. It's not the death and dying that's the hardest aspect, truthfully, for me. It's really not. This is part of life. But it's the evolving role of chaplaincy, which I think is such an exciting time. It's a really exciting time to be a chaplain.
Thank you. And I think we're seeing a theme across everybody here of constantly learning, constantly developing, constantly evolving. Chaplaincy is not like accounting. I'm going to get emails about this, ragging on accountants, but there is no one body of knowledge that if you just learn it all, now I'm fully a chaplain. No, it's going to change every day, every year, and you're going to grow into it as you keep doing that work. Thank you, Sarah. Jason, for you, the most rewarding, the most challenging aspects of this work.
Oh, goody. All right. So for me, I'm a bit of a chaplain nerd, right? I love chaplaincy. I think that, especially as a humanist, right? Because I don't really rely on that pastoral thing. I think chaplains we can be people in people's lives that can unleash all kinds of possibilities, right? I think chaplains are just a great thing for people to have in general. Everyone should have one. That said, one of the things that I love about it is when we do this the right way, we can promote a beautiful death, right? And I'm speaking specifically end of life. We know palliative care can get integrated in all kinds of services, but just thinking about end of life and what that means for life in general for most people, because it's such a taboo thing. We don't really talk about it unless it's happening. And then it's this thing where you really don't want to address it because it kind of infects everything. But when you have, as a family, as a collective, a beautiful death, what I've seen that do for families, the kind of healing it provides, and that's inclusive of the bereavement care, it enhances their life in a way that is profound to me. And it changes the way that you experience, future kind of medical issues. It changes the way that you go about your interactions with your loved ones, because you understand the complexity of that a lot of times. So when people are close enough to it, I've seen it do some absolutely amazing things. So I love the beautiful death. It's very rewarding. That said, at the same time, when we don't do it the right way, it's really rough because we create a lot of issues. And a lot of times that's because of the healthcare systems. It may be due to people's beliefs where maybe they're pushing too hard to have more life rather than have a better quality of life. But when chaplains are involved in some serious healthcare issues earlier on, it allows people to then make better decisions. So it allows the system to actually give them what they need, what they desire in a better way. But unfortunately, when we don't do it the right way, we can see some really ugly things. And unfortunately, we all too often get involved later on in the process, and it doesn't allow for the families and those left behind to have that good experience of a death. So there are some things in the systems that we can clean up a little better, I think. And for me, that's the most frustrating thing, because I think people actually deserve to have good end-of-life experiences for their loved ones. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Paul, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know if I do appreciate what Jason and Sarah have already said, and I'm looking forward to what Edward has to say. So I hope it builds on it. And I kind of live by the phrase that we are who we hang around with. So in palliative care, that is the best way to learn how to do this. There are some great courses that I put in the chat from the California State University, and it gives us some great propositional knowledge things. But I don't know if the panelists would also agree. There's just something about you go to rounds every day and you learn terms like scopolamine and ketamine and, you know, Versed, and but you also learn this stuff around how we talk. You also get to learn how we support one another, and that is incredibly rewarding. My favorite moment was hanging out with a blood marrow transplant patient and doing a ritual before they got their transplant. Jewish palliative physician, a Christian nurse practitioner, and the couple, the guy having the transplant was Jewish, his wife was Christian, and we kind of did this like mishmashy, you know, I mean, it was awesome. People were crying, and it was, and I think this is, I don't know if the other panelists would agree. To me, the fleece that I'm after is healing. Healing for them, healing for me. It's just absurd and BS to think that we're people who can control our emotions, and palliative people get that. People who are drawn to this work, the physicians, the nurse practitioners, the social workers, they're folks that they could have been the interventional radiologists, they could have been, you know, the coroner, but they wanted to be the people that hung out, got to hear stories. The thing that's most challenging, I would say, is this, and I think it's Sarah, Edward, and Jason all are kind of drawn to the stuff around being nerds and researchy. We're a strange breed in the palliative care world. We're sort of like we're the I don't know. We know there's some data that we're harder to understand. We're talking code language, as some of the data tells us. So perhaps for me and the rest of my career, I'm kind of drawn to this. What does it mean to help the work we do be translated? Because the people we work with say, we like what you do and keep doing that, but like we don't always understand what you tell us how you do what you do. So anyway, thanks very much, Michael, and to the panelists.
I think it's really important to be aware of that for folks that are interested in chaplaincy as a career, a calling, a vocation. You are going to spend a lot of time explaining what it is that you do, no matter where you work, whether it's hospice and palliative care, you know, elsewhere in a healthcare system, outside of healthcare. But we hear this all the time. It's a real challenge, but it's also a moment for education as well. All right, Edward, close out this round of questions, the most challenging and most rewarding parts of your work.
The most rewarding, meaningful part is what Paul was mentioning. I find it very enriching to work in the context of a team and not in a silo. I'm not alone, but I do this work with lovely, amazing human beings that are not all chaplains. They're physicians, social workers, nurses, etc. And as Paul was describing, this is just where we can be very real with each other. We cry, we laugh a lot, we use humor, and to be able to have a community so intimate and so much part of me and me part of them it's a beautiful experience that I've never experienced in the context of other work settings, right? And to do this as a team, to come alongside other human beings in very challenging moments, to try to understand them and accompany them and be their allies, right? And have as much as that is possible improve their quality of life. That's awesome for me, right? That makes me return every day, wake up, right? Wanting to do and love what I do every day, right? There's other aspects of what's meaningful, but I think I want to raise that, right? That's probably number one, right? The challenging, it's subjected to the season. And so I say this, I would, and this gives me the opportunity of what is challenging year one in palliative medicine, right? It makes me think about what you're exposed to in high frequency, and that's that you're exposed to death and dying a lot. And so I think not just for chaplains, but many palliative care practitioners, this experiencing death and dying a lot prompts a lot for you inside your humanity, right? It makes you think about your own death and dying, the death and dying of your loved ones. And so I say that because as you're entering this is, I want to say that this is an experience that many talk about, right? How do I do that? You know, how do I deal with it? What is going on inside of me? And although this is not formal training to work on this, right? Part of what we did as a team and what was recommended for me to deal with those challenges was to do psychoanalysis, and I did, right? And in other words, I was responding to certain needs of my own humanity, right? And so I say that because I forgot to mention that in the beginning, but I think one of the things that I want to identify as the most challenging thing today, and probably through my experience in chaplaincy, has been about policy and advocacy for our work, right? There's many barriers institutionally, you know, and I don't live and work to try to deal with the higher ups in advocacy, but I know that that is part of our work, the advocacy for our work to the higher ups, right? That can be daunting at times. It's challenging, but it's a much necessary type of work too. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you. We're right here at the top of the hour, so we're going to switch to, you'll have the chance to do a small group discussion if you like, with one of our guests just until 9:30. So I will open the breakout rooms and each of our guests will be in one of those breakout rooms, and then you can choose one as you like, or you can jump around, whatever you want to do. So I'm going to do that. We'll stop the recording.